Hey everyone, it's Peter Kerr from Rock Daydream Nation, and I have my mate from Texas, Reed Little. How are you, mate?
I'm doing great, Peter. Thanks for the invitation. I've been looking forward to this one.
Absolutely. And on Rock Daydream Nation, we just don't talk about music. We talk about film. We talk about books. We talk about art. And we are going to talk about The Warriors from 1979. So this was directed by Walter Hill. Did reasonable business when it first, was screened, but it is what you would call a cultural phenomenon. It has got a lot of legs, a lot of cross generation of fans. And it's the film that just keeps on keeping on. So today we're just going to talk about what we like about the film, maybe what we don't like about the film, its cultural impact, and just shoot the shit about the film in general. So, Reed, tell me what you think about The Warriors from 1979.
Well, one, if, and sorry, anybody's watching this later, if you see me glancing off to the side, I've got the IMDb page up to my right here because I cannot remember the names of stars and things. I need some notes, and that's where I've got it. But this is a movie that I watch regularly. I find it endlessly entertaining. I showed it to a younger friend of mine and her teenage daughter just a couple of years ago, and they both said it's the only film I've ever showed them that they both enjoyed. So this is a woman who's 20 years younger than I am and her teenage daughter, and they were both like, yeah, this film's great. It is, like Peter said, directed by Walter Hill. Walter is a fascinating figure. He also did the other film of his that I'm really familiar with is Streets of Fire.
Streets of Fire. Also, he basically invented the action comedy genre through 48 Hours. A lot of people,
48 Hours. That's right.
yeah, magnificent film. And everyone thinks, oh, Eddie Murphy, Nick Nolte, but he single-handedly made that a box office bankable type of genre, the action comedy.
Right. And he's got
So
a great quote about that film in IMDb where he says, I have no idea why people call that a buddy cop movie. Those two characters were never buddies.
exactly, exactly.
So one of his stylistic things is that he grew up watching Westerns and he visualizes all of his movies as Westerns, which
Yes.
is why in The Warriors, one of the warriors wears a cowboy hat. One of the warriors is dressed in Native American regalia. There's a guy named Cowboy. There are no semi-automatics. Everybody's got revolvers, you know. So he keeps this Western theme going, even in this street gang. Coming at this film in 2022, if you're not familiar with what the environment was like in New York City in the 70s, gang had a very different connotation. So we're not talking about international criminal organizations. This is not like the Bloods and the Crips. We're talking about street gangs. These are collections of youths who owned small pieces of territory known as their turf, often just one block in New York City. So the Warriors is famous because Walter Hill said he wanted to keep it semi-realistic. It's fantastical, but also semi-realistic. And one of
Yes.
the realistic things is that you have the gangs in the movie are made up of small groups of people. Some of them have a very fantastic bent. We can get into that later, but they're not heavily armed. They're not carrying semi-automatic weapons. They're not wearing bulletproof vests. They're not fighting over cocaine. These are people who wear colors. They are identified by a specific uniform. They have a name and they have a territory. But when they fight, it's mostly hand-to-hand improvised weapons, pipes, chains. They might, like one guy has a switchblade, one guy has a straight razor at one point. There are a couple of guns in the movie, but it was a very different thing than if you did a movie about gang warfare now. it would be a very different product, right?
Semi-automatics, there'd be drugs. And you are 100% right, because this movie is all about turf, about battle
Turf
for
and
turf,
pride.
turf and pride. Yes.
I mean, I don't, what do you think is the easiest way to go through this? You want to kind of talk chronologically or just
Oh,
thematically?
we can just go in all different directions, but I'll just bring a little bit of history of Walter Hill, and then we can start it off. So Walter
Sure.
Hill has got great pedigree. He was a second unit director on Bullet. Wow. I mean, if he was a second unit director, I'd like to do some more research and see if he was involved in that famous car chase scene with Steve McQueen.
Yeah.
He was involved on The Getaway with Sam Peckinpah, and that's quite interesting because I think Sam Peckinpah was definitely a mentor, and he was very influenced by his style, which is prevalent in The Warriors, with a lot of the slow motion and the jump editing and just the way this movie's cut. There's a lot of stylism from Sam Peckinpah. Some of the movies that Walter Hill's done, the year before, he did a very uber cool movie with called The Driver with Ryan O'Neal, and got a
Sure.
great performance out of Ryan O'Neal, which is an achievement. Ryan O'Neal doesn't say much in the movie, so that just speaks volumes. But it's a great movie, one worth checking out. And then he did The Warriors, and then you look at his filmography. He did a lot of westerns, a lot of stylized westerns. He did The Long Riders, and the gimmick of that movie with The Long Riders is you had different actor families. You had the Carradines, you had the Quaids, and there's another family group in that movie that I forget. And I think that was nominated for a Palme d'Or in Cannes. So that got a lot of sort of great reviews. Streets of Fire, which is like, it's got lineage to The Warriors, ultra stylized, sort of a gang movie. That flop, didn't do so well.
Oh, it did not.
No, but I like it a lot, and we could do that for another show. Extreme Prejudice with Nick Nolte, which is like a Western. Southern Comfort, taking the Deliverance into the Cajun country, but putting his spin on it. Again, that's like a Western. And then, as I said earlier, 48 Hours, which is just basically really invented the box office gold of the action comedy. So
Right.
he's got a lot of action pedigree, but I always find that his movies have intelligence, characterization, and there is depth. So there's a lot of action movies where you have the actors, they're just sort of like chess pieces. And it's basically moving them from one part of the board to the other board, and there are action scenes in between. This movie, I think Hill always has depth. There's always characterization. Even in 48 Hours, it's, you think it's a funny action comedy. There is depth, there is characterization, there is a layer that you can analyze. And I really think simply The Warriors is his finest film. It's cinematic,
Okay.
it's widescreen, and the depth of the characterizations are kind of rich. Yes, it's got that cartoonish element to it, but there are some themes there like a brotherhood, loyalty, temptation. It's loosely based on Homer's Odyssey, and it follows the sort of many sort of those Hollywood movies where there's a journey, even going back to Wizard of Oz, Reed, where going from A to B, and there's all these temptation and all these diversions and things that happen along the way. So it's sort of like a quasi road film, getting from one end of New York to the other. But I think Walter Hill, fine director. It's very rich. So yeah, that's my initial take. I thought I'd just bring a little bit of the Walter Hill story into it,
Sure.
in the movie.
One of the things that I absolutely love, and again, for any of our younger viewers, and I hope there are some younger viewers watching this, it's hard to think of a time when life existed before these things. And yet, these are pretty recent inventions. And it's funny to go back and watch a movie shot in 1979 and go, you know what? all of the problems in this could have been resolved with a phone call, right? Or what I love about it is this may be the first movie to feature the equivalent of a flash mob before there was such a thing as flash mobs, because you've got the radio DJ and she's not exactly providing like they're here, they're doing this, they're at this location, but she provides a play-by-play. They just encountered this gang. Now, the gangs would know who's or where the territory of that gang was. So by following their progress through fighting these gangs, the other people listening to that radio broadcast know where the warriors are and are able to track them down. So it's very much like, an Instagram flash mob. And I think it may be the first example of that sort of thing.
Yes.
And the way that you would do it long before cell phones were a thing.
Absolutely. So you've got all these gangs, and they basically congregate somewhere. Look, I'm not ultra familiar with New York. I've been there a few times, but in a Central Park type location. And they are all joined together to meet Cyrus, who's got this proclamation of, we're all gathered here. Let's be one super group and we can take over the town for our turf. And you've got all these different types of gangs in multicolored, different regalia. But the warriors themselves are quite interesting because they're multicultural. Because a lot of the gangs that you see in these movies are either Asian or Negro, but the warriors themselves are multicultural, all different types of personalities. And the thing that I really focus on beyond the action, which is just so masterfully done, is the characterizations, because you've got all different types of personalities within this subcell, the warriors. You've got the really brash sexual Ajax, he just thinks with his, and he's not rational, but he's hot-headed and thinks he should be the boss. You've got Swan, who's Michael Beck, the leader. And Michael Beck in this movie, his performance gets better every time I see the movie, because when I first saw the movie, I thought he was a bit sour, and it's sort of, I don't know if I like his performance or like him, but he is the steady hand of this whole movie, because everything revolves around him. So he's really the leader. And then you have all these different sort of characters within the group, and they represent a personality or a trait. It's just really, it's like a microcosm of society within this group, and how they sort of go across from one end of New York to the other. So what happens? Cyrus gets assassinated. The finger is pointed at the warriors, and they have to get back to their home turf, and it's a journey. And then they encounter all these diversions, and sort of the ticking time bomb is, will they make it out alive? And that's the whole focus, and that's the whole thrill of this movie.
So I'd like to say a couple of things about the nature of the gangs. So one thing about the gangs in the movie is that they're not pigeonholed to a certain age. Now, the warriors are all young men. There's clearly one who's younger than any of the others. I can't remember what his character name is, but it's not like you've got guys in their early 20s pretending they're teenagers. And when you go to the Gramercy Riffs, who were kind of the apex gang in this movie, there's a scene where they're standing, I think, in a parking garage, and you see this whole lineup of the Gramercy Riffs. And again, it's multicultural. It's black. They're black and white, but there are dudes in there that are clearly like in their 40s. So these are not just kids. It's people who are in the gang life. And this is one of the things that Walter Hill was saying, that he wants it to be kind of realistic, a little fantasy still, but kind of realistic. There's even a skinhead gang, probably not the most unrealistic gang, but there's a skinhead gang that's got both black and white members in it. And I'm like, yeah, that wouldn't fly in any skinheads I've ever known. But this is the type of thing that when you try and describe the difference between classical filmmaking, and 1979 is long enough ago that you can call it classical. Yes, it's not the 1930s, but it's definitely classical. Compare what you would see in a gang movie in 1979 to a modern movie. It's not just the fact that it's multicultural. In 2022, they would be rubbing your face in how multicultural it is, right? This is just, it's a thing. It's a fact. These guys are family. They're the only family they have. That's one thing about all of these gangs. Their ultimate loyalty is to each other. When you look at their social groups, they start with the gang. Everything else comes second.
Yeah.
And it's very matter of fact. And even though the characters, no one explains to you what the character's personality is. This is something that just drives me crazy in modern movies. A character in most modern movies will be assigned one character trait, and other people will comment on that character trait so that you know what it is, right? And even though nobody ever does that in this movie, nobody is ever like, hey, see that guy in the cowboy hat? He's cowboy and he acts this way. You never have any trouble telling the warriors apart. They all have individual personalities. They are all consistent through the length of the movie. Swan is, rational's the wrong word, but he's the most level-headed of the gang. Ajax, again, there's your Odyssey connection, or at least your classical Greek connection. Ajax is the most violent, no, we need to solve this through violence. And Swan's like, look, it's a long way home. We can't fight the entire way. We can fight once in a while. And I'm going to go ahead and mention one of my favorite scenes in the movie. And there are so many good scenes in the movie. And my favorite thing about the Warriors, let me encapsulate it as this. It's fantastic, but believable at the same time. When Walter Hill does a character moment, the characters are so correct. You watch them and you go, yes, real people would say this. Real people would act this way, which that is not something I say about a lot of modern movies, frankly. So there's a scene where the warriors are traveling and they come into the territory of a scrub gang known as the Orphans. The Orphans are described as so low on the totem pole, they don't even count. They're called the Orphans, and again, they don't have to explain to you who the Orphans are, right? They call them the Orphans. One guy says, yeah, these guys are scrubs, and you get it. They're the gang members that nobody else wanted, so they combined and make the Orphans. So but there's a bunch of them. There are, at this point, 8 warriors. There were 9. One of them gets taken off immediately, so there's 8 making their way home to Coney Island. And Swan looks him over and he's like, there's like 15 guys standing there. And Ajax is going, let's fight. And he's like, I'm going to go talk to him. And one of them actually goes, when did you become the United Nations? And that may not be the exact quote, but he says, when did you become a diplomat? So he and his lieutenant walk up to talk to this guy to parley. And the guy's fronting, right? The guy from the Orphans is acting all tough. And he clearly is just, if it was fisticuffs right there, he would be so dead. But he's got his boys behind him, so he's lipping off. And they're like, look, just let us pass through. We don't want any hassle. And then this girl comes down and she starts lipping off and instigates trouble. Yes, Mercy. And the guy goes, look, all you have to do is take off your colors. Just take off your colors and you can pass through our territory and nobody will say a word about it. Yeah. That's it. You just walk through as civilians, no hassles. It's the most reasonable request anybody could possibly make, but it doesn't matter because the warriors are here on the gang ladder and the orphans are here. And even though there's twice as many orphans, the warriors are like, yeah, we can't do that. And then it's on. And I'm like, you know what? That is exactly how that would go down. That is exactly how that would go down.
It's you're spot on, and it's a pivotal scene. I just want to go back one more scene, back to the earlier scene where you've got and look, apologies guys, there's a few spoiler alerts, but we have to do a few spoilers in this movie just to discuss how great this movie is. So you've got Cyrus is assassinated, and the way that scene's directed and the crowd are scattering everywhere is just brilliance. The direction, the cutting, basically everyone is scattering everywhere, and there's so many jump cuts. The editing, look, it should have been nominated for an Oscar. I know this for a fact, they do study this in film school, this movie, from an editing point of view, because it's one of the best edited films in Hollywood history, as far as I'm concerned. And that scene, just the different perspective and the camera angles of all the crowd just scattering and then following the warriors into the park, and they realize, it dawns upon them that they are the finger's been pointed at them, that they were the ones that killed Cyrus, even though it was that lovely Luther out of the Rogues.
Right.
Probably one of the most whiniest villains in cinema history, Reed. Wouldn't you say so?
So I freaking love Luther. And this is why I've got IMDb up here, because I can never remember this poor actor's name, and he's so good. David Patrick Kelly.
Yeah.
And as far as I can tell, The Warriors is his first movie role. At least it's the very first entry he's got on IMDb.
And I think
he's so good.
He's got the emotional intelligence of a child. And it's sort of like it's like that recalcitrant kid or teenager, the teasing. And, for him, it's kind of a bit of a head scratch that he's actually the leader of the Rogues, because he's just like a child. And that bit at the end, I know I'm cutting to the end, where he gets those bottles and goes, warriors. I mean, what are the two most irritating sounds? Scratching a blackboard, or that scene with the bottles? I think the bottles probably wins hands down. It's just, you just want to throttle him.
He is, I want anybody, modern eyes looking at this, this guy is the perfect embodiment of the Joker. Years before the Joker, there was the Joker on Adam West TV, but he was an actual clown type Joker, right? But when you're talking about psychotic Joker, the Luther in The Warriors is the perfect Joker. He kills Cyrus at the beginning of that movie for no reason.
Yes, absolutely.
He just, and someone even asked him, why'd you do it? Did it because he wanted to.
Yeah.
Why did he pick on the Warriors? He just happened to look over, and there was a guy in Warriors colors standing there.
Yep.
And he goes, oh, it's that guy right over there.
Absolutely.
He is so random. He's so frightening. Even though he's this weaselly little guy, everybody else in the gang is bigger than he is, but he's insane and he's violent. And when it finally, and for one thing, the Rogues are clearly morons, right? I mean, they don't try to hide that. There's only one other rogue who gets lines, and he asks Luther, what happens to us? And he goes, man, nothing's going to happen to us. Don't worry about it. He's like, no, seriously. Why? We could get really messed up. Why are you doing this?
Yeah.
And Luther says, because I'm having fun.
Yeah. But it is a notch. It could be cartoonish, the characterization, but that actor really sort of puts it on the right side. He is one of the most Weasleyest, annoying villains in movie history. and it definitely makes it compelling. I want to talk about the Mercy character because I find
Sure.
we've chatted offline, and I said to you that what I find the heart and soul of this movie is the relationship, and I think you did as well, between Mercy and Swan, and Deborah Van Valkenburg, I think how you
Right.
pronounce the name. I think it's a great characterization. She comes across initially as this sassy street gang girlfriend, very sexualized, you know, and as the movie goes along, you can see that she's quite vulnerable and there's real human emotion. And, initially the Warriors, she puts herself to the Warriors. I want to go from the, she's actually sort of going up the chain. So she was
Right.
associated
Moving
with
up in
the
the world.
orphans, moving up to the Warriors, and they sort of see her as a sexual plaything. And there is a bit of danger, and you think, oh, okay, are they going to go in that? But she asserts herself. She holds her own. There's a bit of a survival instinct. But as the movie goes around, she's integral to a lot of the key scenes, and there's a real warmth and a relationship between her and Swan. And I think, the actress that plays this part does a really fine role because it develops, it's fully rounded, and it shows a side of a character where the character changed and you see a lot of vulnerability. And there's one of my favorite scenes in this movie is where she is sitting next to Swan in the train,
Right.
and they're there in the gang colors, and opposite them are these people dressed up from a prom. They're all rich and they're all dressed to their nines. And it's like you've got two different sides of society looking at each other, and they're looking down at the Warriors, and Mercy and Swan are looking at them. And there's not any dialogue that's spoken, but it's what is unspoken speaks volumes in this movie. I think it's a great scene, and it just shows about, not only this is just a gang movie where it's going from A to B, it also says about the divide in class and have the haves and the have-nots, and how people look upon each other. And that scene is just wonderful. And just to see the eyes and the facial expressions of both Michael Beck and Deborah Van Valkenburg in that scene is just quite wonderful.
So I want to talk about that a little bit. First, my wife has this thing while we watch movies, she looks up trivia. There's Deborah Van Valkenburg disappears from the movie for about 15 minutes, and then she comes back wearing a jacket. When she first appears, she's just in this sheer pink top. And she comes back later and she's got a jacket on. And Beck even asked her, "Hey, where'd you get the jacket?" She says, "I stole it." She got her arm broken in one of the scenes when a guy grabbed her and he was supposed to let go of her hand and he didn't, and it broke her arm. And they had to, she was out of the movie while they were filming to go get a cast on it. And then to hide the cast, she wore a jacket for the rest of the movie, which is, man, dedication to performance, huh? But she clearly does start off the movie as a sexual plaything. This was not uncommon. It's probably not uncommon now, although you don't see this trope, I think, in as many modern movies, maybe because we're trying to get rid of the stereotype of women as downtrodden, subjected characters. But she exists. She finds self-worth through her sexual value to other people. And there's a scene where she offers herself to Michael Beck, to Swan, and Swan rejects her. And you can just see it crushes her that he doesn't want to do it. But when you get to that scene on the train, I want to offer just a bit of a tweak on it. The prom kids, they're not rich people, right? This scene is several layers more pathetic than that. These are average kids. If they were rich, they wouldn't be riding the New York subway at night home from their prom. So these are just middle-class kids. And you're talking about this entire movie, every problem the Warriors have faced has been met with violence, whether real violence or threatened violence. This time, none of the warriors say a word. These kids come in, they sit down, they're clearly scared because they're all these gang members. But instead of it leading to violence, you can just see Swan and Mercy looking at a normal life and going, I want that. I am fighting for my very existence. And these people are just out having a good time. And there's a scene where, Mercy looks down at this other girl's shoes, and then she checks her own legs, and they're all covered with bruises, because she's been fighting and stuff. She gets hit with a bat at one point. And it's just so pathetic.
And that's why this movie is just so brilliant, Reed, because there's so many layers to that. And I know, look, I'll take your point. When I say rich, it's comparison.
Well, yeah,
they have rich lives, maybe not monetarily. We're from the back streets. We're in struggle street. So it's a comparison. But that scene, I think it's one of the truly great scenes, provides a contrast to their lives.
Yes, absolutely. There are only, in this entire movie, there's only a couple of scenes that I think really kind of fall flat. One of them, and again, spoilers for a movie that came out in 1979, is one of the warriors who's actually protecting Mercy gets caught by the police. He's struggling with a policeman on a subway station, a subway platform, and he gets thrown in front of an oncoming train in slow motion, right? So you're like, ah! And you know what's never brought up again? You're like, none of the other warriors saw him die. I was always under the impression that Mercy saw it, but my wife pointed out Mercy was actually running away. So she did not really see what happened to him. She just saw him struggling with the police. This is such a shocking scene. It feels like it ought to have weight and impact, right? But because nobody knows it happened, it has no weight. It has weight for you as the viewer for whatever emotional attachment you had to that character. But to the remaining warriors, one of them being killed should be massive. And it has no impact at all because they don't know that it happened. And I always think, you know what? That falls a little flat because that should have been brutal.
Well, some interesting trivia. The actor that was thrown in the train had major issues with Walter Hill. And there was some so I think there was a reason for that.
Okay, there you go. See, I did not know that. Okay, so the next character, if you will, although in this case it's a group character, another gang that I really love, is the all-female gang, the Lizzies. Now, again, I keep bringing up this historical thing, but let me tell you, watching this movie in 2022, especially if you're brand new to it, was an extremely different experience than seeing it in 1979. For vast majority of America, when they hear it's the Lizzies gang, they are lesbians is not the first thing that they would think. And I actually really like this scene because even though you're watching it now and maybe thinking you feel like it's beating you over the head with it, I guarantee you in 1979, middle America watched this movie and had no idea that these women were lesbians. I guarantee it. Yeah. So the Lizzies start out, they're just hanging out, right? Gang territory was usually centered around a hangout spot of some sort. And they see 3 of the warriors. Now, the warriors are all young, energetic, stupid young men.
Perfect diversion.
Perfect diversion. They see the Lizzies and they're like, hey, I know we're running for our lives and may
But
all die if we don't get back, but
let's do a pit stop.
chicks, man.
Yeah, let's do a pit stop.
So they go over to him and say, hey, where are your men? Again, I mean, this is a reasonable question. It's an all-female gang. So they would naturally be assumed to be attached to a group of male gang members. They said, oh, they're off busy doing stuff. Oh, okay. So they take them off to their hideout and they say, hey, let's just party. And there's 3 members of the Warriors, including the youngest member, who's, and again, I cannot stress again, we've talked about the characterization. The characterization here is so good because you can tell it's not like the kid doesn't like women. He's like, what are we doing? Where are the other guys? Why are we involved in this?
Why aren't we going to? We want to get home. We want to get to Coney Island.
It's so believable. And the other two, I mean, it's a little less believable that maybe these guys are like, hey, we're just going to stop and party with these chicks, but maybe not. You know, if the guys are testosterone fueled enough, but then they put on the music and there are 2 women dancing together. There's your big cue that the Lizzies don't have males associated with them.
Yes.
So again, in this scene, it's a masterclass. He doesn't have to tell you what's going on. You understand it from watching the action. It's believable that these men who live basically for nothing but sex and violence. Again, they're not drug dealers. They're not like, you know, major international criminals. These are territorial gang members, and all they live for is protecting their turf and probably, you know, as much sex as they can have. It gets Ajax nabbed in another scene. We can talk about that.
Yeah.
But so that's all they've got is sex and violence. And it's the sex that gets them tied up.
Absolutely. As a diversion in the journey, you know, on the way home. It's a road movie, and the diversions are always of the sex or violence. Either they've got to bat themselves through a gang, or there's a diversion of sex. And this is a great scene. I got a heads up about the scene before I even knew about the movie, because it was referred to in the Time magazine reviews. I used to love reading Time magazine reviews because got it in Australia, and a lot of the movies would be held back in Australia for months, and it'd be always good to read the review ahead. And there was a reference to it, a lesbian scene, or with a lesbian gang, which is a bit of a spoiler alert. But I concur with you 100%. If I saw this movie, I think it's beautifully thought out, and it doesn't sort of telegraph who they are. It's a slow reveal. And yeah. But go on. Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, and yet when you're watching it, when you're sitting there watching it, you think, how can they not see this as a trap? But in the fictional world of the movie, it's perfectly believable that these guys would not see the trap. Absolutely.
You know, one thing I've got to give a kudos to is the cinematography of Andro Laszlo. It shows the grit and grime of 70s decaying New York to a T. I'm a sucker for dirty, gritty New York movies, like your Taxi Drivers and even Times Square, which is another movie favorite of mine. But this 1979, it's all through the subways, and it's got the fine balance between the grit and the neon. And you can see that I think around this time, New York was really on its knees. There was it was basically going through bankruptcy. There was so much crime. Graffiti was everywhere. It was really gritty. And the cinematography really picks this up well. And I think a big tick, big kudos in this movie to the work of Andro Laszlo.
Yes, I was going to talk about New York as a character. You hear this a lot, that films shot in New York City, that New York City is a character in the movie. And I often do not agree with that statement, but even it is 100.
Even Taxi Driver?
Well, no, I'm just saying that often that's just a cliche.
Yeah.
But in this movie, it's 100% true. And my favorite thing about it is New York. Some of what you're seeing is set dressing, but a lot of it isn't. You know, when they're showing the trash on the streets piled up against the support pillars for the subway, that was New York in 1979. When they show all of the graffiti, when they show, they go into these subway cars and they're just covered with graffiti inside and out. They weren't making up those cars; they were just shooting on the subway. That's what the subway looked like in New York in 1979.
Yeah.
In Coney Island, they get to Coney Island and it just looks terrible. Things are boarded up and it's broken down and there's
Yeah.
tumbleweeds and trash and graffiti everywhere. And that's really what Coney Island looked like in 1979. It gives you a sense of time and place that is absolutely overwhelming.
And that's what I love about 70s cinema. It's my favorite decade of cinema. I think American cinema in the 70s was at its absolute stone cold peak. A lot of people argue about the 30s and the 40s, but I think 70s cinema was just great. And this really perfects the portraying, as you said, New York as a character, a living, breathing organism that's rotting and decaying. And it just comes out in spades. Um, when this movie was released, there was actually reports of gang violence. So it came out and they had to actually turn around their advertising campaign because the original bill poster is all the photos of the different gangs, with the baseball bats, and it was very out there. And I think they had to really change the marketing campaign. And I've got a few mates in America, similar age, and they said that this movie didn't even get played in their parts of America that were quite conservative. So I think the big story that came over to Australia in the press were there was actual murders or gang violence when this was first released. So it did sort of hit a raw nerve or hit a nerve with a lot of maybe the gangs or maybe that sort of that audience. And it's certainly they had to adjust their marketing just to tone it down, which I think is quite an interesting fact.
There's a fascinating, if you go to the IMDb page, there's a ton of quotes from Walter Hill about this movie. And one of them, he talks about, he thinks that it may have been popular with young men, and gang members, because he doesn't portray gangs in a negative light. Gang movies were common. I mean, really common in trash cinema, especially in the 60s and 70s, movies that were shot explicitly to go to drive-ins in the United States. And I know Australia is like the only other place on earth that has a drive-in culture, right?
I love it. Love it. Yep.
So these movies, there were a lot of gang movies, but gangs were always these horrible, evil scourges of society. And he's like, and ours is much more matter of fact. And on the one hand, I agree with that. But on the other hand, the movie makes it pretty clear that that's not a great choice. For whatever sociological reasons they were in this gang, again, when you get that one view, and there's only one view of normality in this entire movie, and when you get it, it's so shockingly different. And they just clearly go, oh man, I want that.
Mm.
And then they're instantly pulled back out of that into their own world because they can't have it.
Absolutely.
And there's a scene at the end. Every movie about New York in the 1970s is about how much people want to get out of New York City, right?
Or aspire to better places. Well,
right.
Maybe there are some classic movies where people do aspire and they look across the river to go into New York. The one that comes to mind, which is another gritty movie, is Saturday Night Fever, when John Travolta and his lads, they look across at New York and they're in Jersey and they aspire to go into New York. So that goes the reverse direction. But yeah, I agree.
Right.
A lot of them want to come out. But maybe we can talk about how this movie is quite influential, because I'm thinking that there's a lot of cinema that was kind of stylistically ripped it off or it sort of was influenced. And I know John Carpenter and Walter Hill, they're great directors, great genre directors. And I sort of think that Escape from New York wouldn't have been filmed if it wasn't for the Warriors. I know it's more of a science fiction bent, but there is a journey aspect, and it's got a bit of that futuristic but grit and grime. I sort of think Escape from New York is, there is a bit of a nod to the Warriors. What are your views on that take?
That's fascinating. You know what? I had never considered that, but I'll buy it.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things, and this is like if people are ever discussing the Warriors, one of the most famous things about the Warriors is that the entire movie is shot at night in the darkness until the Warriors get back to Coney Island, and that's when there's daylight.
Yes.
When they're home, there is light. And it, again, he doesn't have to point it out. Nobody points at the sun and says, hey, look, the freaking sun is out. You experience that. You instantly know, oh, they're safe. And then, of course, the rug is pulled out from under you and they're not safe at all. Warriors come out and play. At the end of Escape from New York is the same way. It's all shot in darkness, except I was trying to think, I don't think the sun ever comes up. I don't think the sun comes up even at the end of it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's other genre films I think have got influenced. I think The Road Warrior, with the stylistic, the different outfits, the aesthetics, even though it's post-nuclear. And Reed and I will do a separate episode on this, guaranteed, but there are so many Italian spaghetti rip-offs of this. Bronx Warriors 1 and 2, those ones after the fall of New York, 2039 AD or whatever. There's a whole fascinating genre of this Warriors type of movie. Another thing about the Warriors, it came out at the same time as another movie called The Wanderers with Ken Wall, which was was set in the 50s gang. I think they virtually came out at the same time. So that may have done some damage initially to the Warriors in the confusion. But very fascinating. At exactly around the same time, you had two gang movies come out.
I was not aware of The Wanderers. We had talked a bit before. We were going to talk about the gangs in the movie. So the gangs in this movie, they run the gamut, right? Again, Hill wanted to have fantasy, realistic fantasy in some ways, but sometimes the gangs go off the deep end. So the Warriors by themselves, very believable. The Gramercy riffs, very believable. The Orphans, again, I think the Orphans were perfect. But then you have like the Baseball Furies are the one that everybody brings up because they're ridiculous. They wear baseball uniforms. They've got baseball bats, face paint. Yep. They're like sports hooligans, right? Although actually there's another gang later. I don't think they're named. I don't think anybody calls them out. Maybe they do, where they're all like they look like they just came off the set of Hee Haw. They're in striped long sleeve shirts and overalls, like denim overalls, and one guy on freaking roller skates. And kids, if you're watching this in 2022, understand that in 1979, roller skating culture was huge in the United States for about a year.
Roller boogie.
Oh yeah, there's some fantastic crap cinema with people on roller skates. That's a different genre altogether.
Hello, Linda Blair.
God, I love that movie. So the Baseball Furies are the dumbest, and yet that is also the gang that gets the most action. And I was like, I'm not a young man. I'm asthmatic. And watching those guys run through Central Park and run and run and run, I'm like, oh my God, I'd have dropped dead long ago. And they make some nods to believability in terms of like, there's a scene where Swan, two guys are holding him and he gets beaten pretty severely. And later he's got like gashes on his cheeks and bruises and stuff. But then there's other scenes, people get whacked in the gut and over the back of the head with baseball bats. And, it's not that scene from The Untouchables where he's He's going off
Yeah,
with the
I
baseball
know.
bat.
I know. I
Um,
know. Well, it got rated R over here. R is the strongest sort of certification. So it means that people over 18 couldn't see it. So I think it got probably an R over there, or it wouldn't have got an X, but basically for the strong violence.
right.
But yeah, the gangs are interesting, but the Furies are my least favorite, if you know, just from a viewer
And
perspective. Um,
and yet they are unquestionably the most copied gang from this movie.
and popular. You go to fan conventions, you look at the fan conventions, and people are always dressed up in that garb. And the Italian rip-off spaghetti versions pick up on the Furies and amplify it to the power of 100. So you get all
Yes.
these ones in top hats and sparkly clothes and the Bronx Warriors, which we will talk about again. But it all picks up from that fantastical sort of side of the movie, which is the Furies. The music. We must talk about the
Yes.
music. The soundtrack is great. I picked it up at a record fair recently. It's not easy to get. They should
I
just do a
believe that.
nice, fresh release of it. It's brilliant. Um, Barry Dvorak did it. It's kind of electronic. It's sort of like Tangerine Dream, and it drives the action along. It's sort of very sort of metronomic, and it's sort of, it's sort of in syncopation with the action. They've got to
Now,
get to the next stop.
here's another point where Walter Hill and John Carpenter are very similar. Listen to the soundtrack for The Warriors and listen to the soundtrack for Halloween. Now, of
Yes,
course, Carpenter is doing it all himself, so you got to give him mad props for that. But there's a lot of stylistic things that he's borrowing
crossover,
from outside sources. Yeah.
crossover,
Pardon me.
crossover, and it finishes with a Joe Walsh song that I love. I
And
mean,
it
it,
gets a credit at the beginning of the movie. I think it was made
yeah,
just for that movie.
and
And
it's perfect. I like it a lot.
it and the way they introduce it, again, the radio voice acting as the Greek chorus for the entire movie. She's on periodically through the entire movie.
Yes, I've got
And
her
at the
name is Lynn Figpen or something like that. But yeah, just the Greek chorus and
she
just the
comes on
focus
and
on her
says,
lips. Yeah,
"All right, Warriors, we now we heard you, or we heard you didn't do it. I guess we owe you an apology, but all you're gonna get is this song." And then they play the song. And you're like, you know what? In its own way, that sentiment, okay, yeah, you know what? You were wrongly accused, but who cares?
that's so New
Life goes
York.
on in the city.
That's New York.
Yeah. It's also perfect. You're like, "Ooh, brutal," but you know what? It fits. Everything about this movie, the ridiculousness fits, the patheticness fits, the brutal action fits. They said the guys who could have taken the reasonable and easy way out, but they were too freaking proud to do it, fits. The beginning where you have all of the gang members in the park listening to Cyrus give his speech, and you're told, now this is one time you are told about his attributes, because you're told that Cyrus is the one and only, whatever that means. I love that phrase. I hear he's the one and only. Like, yeah, what does that mean? So
Yeah,
when they're together as a mob, they're all, yeah, we're gonna take this city. And all it takes is one spark, just one spark, one bad event, and they vanish. All of that strength evaporates because they, in fact, have no unity whatsoever. They're loyal to each other in that little group, but there's no
brotherhood.
loyalty between the gangs.
Yeah, brotherhood, loyalty. So I think we both agree this is not just an action film or a genre film. It's got layers. It's rich. And certainly it has aged remarkably well. And when it came out, it was critically panned. A lot of the critics of the time, just didn't really rate it. But over time, I think it has been reappraised. And certainly from a technical viewpoint, as I've said earlier, with the editing and the directing and the cinematography, it's quite influential. And I think it's Walter Hill's finest movie. And he's done some great movies. So I really enjoyed this read. We've got to do this again. We'll do 1990, The Bronx Warriors. I think we'll look at the spaghetti Italian ripoffs. So that's definitely coming soon because
We
this movie spawned so many.
we may need to do both trash movies to get a full episode out of it, but I'm down.
Yep,
You just let me know when.
absolutely.
I'll be there.
Absolutely. All right, everyone, please like, subscribe, put your comments for Rock Daydream Nation, and we'll do another movie or music very soon. See ya.